Hi everyone, and welcome to our revised video lecture for week 4. Like last week, we have a revised set of learning objectives, so please note that there have been changes from what was posted before. The learning objectives start with a couple of conceptual issues pertaining to the notion of ethnic cleansing as it relates to our broader conceptualization of genocide. Then we turn to the historical issues involved with the Indian removals as a matter of American Indian policy during the first half of the 19th century. So let's start with some conceptual issues. The top half of this slide should look familiar, as it outlines the conceptual structure of our course, based on the correspondence between Patrick Wolf's phases of settler colonialism and Lemkin's tripartite framework of genocidal techniques. As you can see, we are entering the second part of this structure, looking at the strategy of carceration and the technique of biological genocide designed to restrict or interdict the reproductive capacity of a group. This reproductive dimension is key to genocide. For those of you who've taken underpinnings with me, you may recall how I stressed the point that the etymological root word of genocide, genos, means to give birth or beget. The category of biological genocide opens up many different ways in which this reproductive capacity is destroyed, many of which involve forms of slow death techniques of destruction. Moreover, these techniques undermine not just the organic life forces of individual group members, but their collective social constitution as well. This is an important point here on the bottom right, with this quote by sociologist Martin Shaw, who reminds us that because all groups are social constructions, then their attempted destruction goes beyond attacks on individuals. As it pertains to our broader focus this week, the point here is that we must go beyond the conventional meaning of biological reproduction and consider broader forms of social reproduction as well. More on that later, when I come back to indigenous kinship or a broader concept of genocide, particularly one that pertains to our subject matter this week on forced removals. Recall our reading about Lemkin from week 1, especially with this highlighted bit that quotes Lemkin's passage about the two phases of genocide, which involve destruction and imposition, respectively. Lemkin understood genocide as a type of occupation. The title of his book, after all, was Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. Hence the argument that the notion of genocide is colonial in nature because it entails occupation and settlement. Although that's not really our concern here, which is instead that forced removals and expulsions are often a prelude to a group. It's actually very difficult to conceive of genocide without a territorial dimension because people are embodied and groups of people exist in physical space. Destroying a social group always means destroying, partially if not totally, its presence and its economic, social, and cultural power within a given territory. There is, however, a countervailing argument that maintains a strict distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. This is the argument of American historian Gary Anderson, for example, whose book here I actually used to assign. You can find an article of his with his distilled argument in the supplementary reading folder. And Katz have made a similar argument, which is that the United States never developed a specific intent to destroy Native Americans as such, that there was no final solution to the Indian problem, and no universal offensive against Indians per se. Anderson even says that the Indian survival had much to do with the choice policy of ethnic cleansing rather than genocide. Genocide, he concludes, will never become a widely accepted characterization for what happened in North America, because large numbers of Indians survived, and because policies of mass murder on a scale similar to events in Central Europe, Cambodia, or Rwanda were never implemented. Readings by Jeffrey Osler, you may detect a problem with this line of argumentation, which is partly why I no longer assign this reading. Regardless, I do think that the terminology of ethnic cleansing is entirely relevant to our discussion this week. Although there is no international legal definition of ethnic cleansing, the concept is tacitly included in the 1999 Rome Statute under the definitional rubric of crimes against humanity and war crimes, as seen here. With that said, there are problems with the ethnic cleansing concept. In the first place, there is an ethical concern with the fact that the term was originally coined as a perpetrator's euphemism, terminological denial, and an ideological justification. Moreover, unlike genocide, the root word of which identifies with the victim group, the term ethnic cleansing is based on the perpetrator's standards of purity. Analytically, moreover, there's a problem with drawing a distinction between genocide and ethnic cleansing. proponents tend to ethnic cleansing. Proponents tend to view these two concepts along a spectrum, with forced deportations and population transfers at one end, and massacres and physical annihilation at the other. Yet, like any other spectrum, there is a series of indistinguishable steps in between, where one bleeds into the other. In other words, a boundary between the two. Another analytical distinction often made by proponents is that ethnic cleansing targets victims not based on, quote, who they are, but where they are. But for indigenous peoples, where they are is who they are. This will become clearer later when we consider the relationship between the Choctaw people and Naniwaya. Okay, with that said, let's turn to the history leading up to removal. The relevant section in Osler's book starts by targeting the widespread assumption in 19th century settler society that all quote-unquote primitive or savage races around the world were doomed sooner or later. Yet Osler demonstrates that this was not, in fact, the case. In Appendix 2 of his book, he provides a very detailed analysis of the demographic situation on a nation-by-nation basis, and concludes that, all told, there were actually more Indians east of the Mississippi in 1830 than there had been at the time of the American Revolution, or the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. Now, of course, this wasn't uniform across the board. Some tribes in New England and along the eastern seaboard had diminished, whereas in the Old Northwest and the South, population figures were rebounding. But altogether, there was, in fact, an overall upward trend in population of the Mississippi, thereby bellying the myth of the vanishing Indian. Indeed, this points to the real reason for the so-called Indian problem, which is that they were surviving, and the reality of that survival was itself an act of resistance. In indigenous philosophy, there's this notion of survivance, which denotes a sense of agency that rejects the pretense of voiceless victimization. During the removal era, this form of survivance was manifest in dramatic cultural and political developments, especially among some of the southern tribes, the Cherokee in particular, who established their own written constitution that reaffirmed their sovereignty as a nation state. This really was the heart of the so-called Indian question, which, by the way, was how it was phrased at the time. By the 1820s, the policy debate had shifted. Recall from last week, when the American policy debate during the 1790s revolved around either outright military conquest or negotiated land cessions. Recall as well that land cessions were a sort of Plan A, and extirpative warfare was a backup plan. Yet once the American-Anglo strategic rivalry was resolved after the War of 1812, there was a period of relative peace. In this climate, the debate over Indian policy, the preferred option was the so-called civilizing program of assimilation, which called for a total transformation of indigenous societies through missionary work and educational efforts, combined with altering land tenure and subsistence patterns. This foreshadowed the idea of save the Indian, kill the man, which, as we'll see in week 6, became the dominant policy by the late 19th century. But the problem, and I use that term ironically, of course, was that assimilation was deemed to be either too slow to ameliorate the conflicts precipitated by rampant settler expansion, or too naive regarding the desirability or even capability of the Indians to change their quote-unquote savage ways. Thus, removal emerged as a serious policy option by the 1820s. Either Indians exchanged their lands east of the Mississippi for equivalent territory in the west, or they would be forcibly removed. Either way, proponents assumed that removal was the only way to ensure settler expansion. Removal was central to the electoral platform of Andrew Jackson, who promptly signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 into law. Now, Osler does a great job providing a broad scope of the Indian removals, which in fact was a much broader program that impacted not just the major tribal nations of the South, such as the Cherokee, Choctaw, and so on, but also many northern tribal nations as well. However, in order to fully appreciate the deadly impact of removal, let's look at our other reading this week by Choctaw historian Donna Akers, who underscores the absolutely dire conditions faced during removal. The evacuation of the Choctaw Nation was rather hastily prepared, set by delays in the cold, wet season of winter. Large parties often ended up being concentrated in deportation centers under military command. A lot of people died, especially elders and young ones, and these are the generations that are crucial to the social reproduction of a group. The elders are your repositories of knowledge and anchors of a group. The elders are your repositories of knowledge and anchors to the past, and the young ones are your future. So their deaths can be especially devastating for the social reproduction of a people. So even if the military was not pursuing policies of physical annihilation, people were dying nevertheless. Now, the key point of this reading is to show how the territorial uprooting of a people may be considered a form of genocide. In order to understand the inherent identification of the Choctaw people with this territory, we must attempt to step into their cultural worldview. We need to take into consideration their ontology, their guiding assumptions that they use to perceive their experiences. Using oral traditions rather than documentary records to show how the Choctaw identified with their territory, Akers takes a Choctaw-centric approach in order to understand how the territorial uprooting of removal threatened the ontology and worldview of the Choctaw. As with most other indigenous ontologies, the Choctaw saw themselves as comprisological kin, but fictive kin as well. Fictive kin is an important concept from cultural anthropology, and it refers to how peoples imagine genealogical connections with others. Fictive kin can even be extended to other-than-human life forms, landscapes, and waterways. In the case of the Choctaw, their constitution as a people included the land itself. As explained by Akers, they identify with an ancient burial mound known as Naniwaya, which they call the mother of the Choctaw people. Think about how this designation of Naniwaya as mother reflects a crucial aspect of indigenous kinship. Territory and cultural identity are intrinsically connected. Okay, that's pretty much it. We're going to continue some of the same themes next week, as we not only consider how dispossession restricts group reproduction, but also the broader methods of group destruction that extend beyond the physical death of group members. In particular, we'll continue to think about how land and territory factor into the genocidal process, and we'll take an even closer look at indigenous kinship theory as it relates to the buffalo nations of the Great Plains. More on that next week.